Today we are talking about what is a good argument. How many of you have had an argument recently? You have? How many of you have had an argument recently where you walked away from it feeling good, like something was resolved? That's much less common than actually having a good argument. You have? Good for you. Yeah. Significant other? Friend? Significant other? Is that tall guy I saw you with last week? Yeah. Boyfriend or husband? Boyfriend? Nice. All right, so a good argument has certain criterion, okay? And that criteria is usually not followed when we have arguments, which is why so many arguments turn out terribly. First of all, we aren't following our code of conduct for having a good argument, like being charitable and so on, but we're also not following the foundation of a good argument, okay? And the foundation of a good argument has 5 criterion. And I always remember it SRASR. Okay, that helps me. This does not have a lot of ink in it. So the first one is structural criterion. Yay, I do have another marker. Good. Okay, the argument should have a well-formed structure. We've gone over standard form a little bit. We'll do more of that, but it should have a good structure. We'll go into all of these in more detail. The next one is relevance. The premises of the argument should be relevant to the conclusion. It would amaze you, or maybe it wouldn't because you've probably already experienced it, but it's amazing how many arguments have premises in them that are totally irrelevant to what you're trying to prove. Okay, it has nothing to do with it. And sometimes people do that on purpose in order to sort of throw you off so that they win the argument. Okay. Acceptability criterion. The premises must not only be relevant, but they need to be acceptable to the person you're arguing with. They need to be able to accept those premises. And we'll go through what's acceptable and not acceptable. And then the sufficiency criterion. So the sufficiency argument says that the premises are sufficient to get to the conclusion. Okay, they give enough evidence of the right kind in order for you to conclude something from it. And the last one, which is almost never included, or it's the most rare type, is the rebuttal criterion. Your argument should also address counter-arguments. So before they're even brought up, you should already be considering what the other person's going to say, how they're going to argue back. And if you can address those arguments before the person brings them up, then you're way ahead of the ballgame. Okay. In sales, they do this a lot. When you try to sell someone on something, think of how they're going to counter-argue with you. What issues are they going to have with buying your product? And address those issues before they're brought up, and then you're much more likely to convince somebody. Once somebody gets into the headspace of saying no, or but, or there's this issue, then they're much less likely to purchase from you. Okay, and it's the same with arguing. If you allow them to get into their counter-arguments, then it's going to be a lot harder to convince them. So if you address them first, then it strengthens your argument. Okay? So if an argument meets all of these conditions, then you should be able to accept the conclusion. Whether you like it or not is a different issue, but it should lead to a good conclusion. It's a good argument, okay, for whatever it's concluding. Right? So let me show you some examples, okay? So Governor Reichard is doing a great job. Dawn LaPlante says she's doing a great job, and he's the chair of the Democratic Party. How do you feel about that? This Democratic governor is doing a great job because the head of the Democratic Party says that he's doing a great job. Does that feel like a strong argument? Okay, so you've got your first premise that the Democratic Party chair says they're doing a good job. Conclusion is, therefore, he's doing a good job. Okay, so is the structure okay? You've got premise 1 leading to a conclusion. It's a very basic structure. There's really nothing wrong with it. Fire is hot, therefore if you touch fire, then you feel heat. Structure's right. Okay? Simplistic, but right. Okay. What about relevance? Is the premise, the Democratic chair says that the Democratic governor is doing a good job. Is that a relevant premise? Is it helpful to lead you to the conclusion? If you say that to a Republican, is that going to convince them? No. Why?
It's a strong argument.
It's not a strong argument because it's not a relevant premise. Somebody in your own party says you're doing a good job. It doesn't really matter. Like, it's a very weak premise. It's irrelevant. Okay. My mom says that I'm great at whatever. Like, well, of course your mom's going to say that. It's not. Okay, it's not really relevant. Question is, what did she do as a governor? You know, what's the proof? Okay, it's an irrelevant premise. And we've already addressed acceptability. Is this acceptable as a premise? Depends on who you're talking to, right? And that's one of the things with acceptability that we're going to get into. If you're talking to a Republican, it's not an acceptable premise. That would be stupid to make an argument like that to a Republican. If you're talking to a Democrat, maybe. Okay, still questionable. It's still not great because of the other issue, but it is acceptable for that audience, right? What about sufficiency? Is that enough evidence? No, definitely not. Okay, it's insufficient. And does it cover any counter arguments? No. Okay, so it's failing on a lot of these. The structure's fine, but pretty much everything else has issues. Okay, it's a terrible argument. It's a very weak argument. Now, it might be a correct argument, okay, but it's not enough of an argument in order to get to a valid conclusion. Okay. All right, so let's get into the structural criterion first, okay? So the structural principle is one who argues for or against a position should use an argument that meets the fundamental structural requirements of a well-formed argument, okay? You should follow the structure of good arguments. And there are multiple structures. We're going to talk about them as we go through the class. We've already talked about the most basic form of an argument. Premise or premises lead to conclusion. If this premise, then this conclusion. Okay? Or if these premises, then this conclusion. Okay? If it doesn't follow that, it's not a good argument. Or some variation of that, which you guys haven't learned other variations yet, but you get the idea. Okay? So good structure include premises that, that's an S, premises that don't contradict each other. Okay? They shouldn't contradict each other. They shouldn't contradict the conclusion. All students cheat on exams, and honest students never cheat. Therefore, there are no honest students. That's contradictory. All students cheat on exams. Honest students never cheat. Well, I just said all students cheat on exams. So I can't say that honest students don't cheat, because I just said that's not possible if all students are cheating on exams. Okay? So contradictory premises. Doesn't make sense. People surprisingly do stuff like that a lot. Okay? Another requirement of structural criterion is no circular reasoning. Does anybody know what circular reasoning is? Premise leads to another premise that comes back to another premise. Uses the premise is assuming the very thing that you're trying to establish. It's assuming the conclusion. So, like an example of circular reasoning would, we should trust the Bible because the Bible is the Word of God, and we know that the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible says so. Okay, so you're using the conclusion as a premise in order to prove the conclusion. Right? And people do that a lot. It's a bad argument. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, but the way you're arguing is poor, and good luck convincing somebody using an argument like that. Okay. So, yeah, we already talked about that. All right. So the relevance principle, okay, the book says one who argues for or against a position should attempt to set forth only reasons that are directly related to the merit of the conclusion or position at issue. Okay. So relevance is the premises are directly related. Now, sometimes we can have premises that are indirectly related and they feel valid. Like the governor one was tricky. It feels valid, but it's not really, it's not directly related. Okay. An example would be, you should vote for this governor because she's a good mom and she's been married for 37 years, and so she'll make a great governor. Okay, it's kind of indirectly related. Kind of, like I could see how being a good mom and, being able to maintain a good marriage might make you the type of person who could be a good governor, but does it really directly prove anything about your ability to govern? No. Okay. So yeah, it's indirectly related, but it's not directly related. So therefore, that is not relevant. But notice that's what political ads do all the time. Trump overtans himself, therefore he's a bad president. Okay. I mean, you've got a point, like the tan thing, like even Republicans don't like that whole orange man deal. But does that have anything to do with him being a good president directly? No. Okay, far from it. There's been a lot of presidents who have had some fashion issues over the years. So we use these arguments all the time in this world, but they're really not relevant, which means it's a bad argument. Okay, it's a bad argument. So the test would be, does the premise provide a reason to believe the conclusion? Okay, so the test of relevancy is, does the premise provide a reason to believe the conclusion? So if I said something like, you should vote for this governor because she successfully sponsored 3 pieces of legislation to lower taxes and make life easier for the middle class, or something like that. Okay, that's directly relevant. That does provide a reason to believe the conclusion. That's a good argument. Whether the other argument was true or not, it's still a bad argument. And you're not going to convince a lot of people, unless they're highly emotional and illogical and not thinking straight, which a lot of people are in that category, unfortunately. Okay, so it has to have bearing on the truth of the conclusion. If it doesn't, it's irrelevant. All right, so the acceptability premise. Are the premises, now the premises might be good, but are they acceptable to the person that you're arguing with? Okay. So the book says, one who argues for or against a position should use premises that are likely to be accepted by a rational and mature audience. Okay. And specifically tailored for that audience too. That's another part of it. Okay. Don't try to argue with crazy. It doesn't work. People are immature. If people are irrational or illogical, then it doesn't matter how good your argument is, it's not going to work. Okay, just don't waste your time. That's why arguing on social media is so dumb. I know we all do it, but we shouldn't. Okay? It's hard to change anybody's opinion on social media. Something about the online world that makes people irrational, or it attracts the crazies. Maybe that's what it is. Okay, so it's about credibility and it's about believability. Credibility and believability. What does it mean if something's credible?
Valuable.
Say it again?
Resourceful.
It's resourceful, a little bit more than that.
Like something that is true, like if it's credible, it might have like more like news sources or like research on it.
Mm-hmm. So basically it means the same thing, that it's believable. Okay. So if something is incredible, it means like that's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that. If something is credible, then yeah, I can believe it. There's some credence to it. There's some evidence behind it. There's the possibility of believing it. Okay. So this is actually pretty redundant for your book to say credibility and believability, but there's a little bit of a nuance. So credibility implies evidence. Okay, there's some evidence behind it that makes it credible. Okay, so if a premise or premises are not acceptable to your audience, why would they accept your conclusion? Okay, that's why we have to do this. And pay attention to arguments. You'll see people, because people get so emotional, a lot of times they don't care about whether their argument is acceptable. It's their argument, and you should just accept it because they feel strongly about it. And that's just not the way it works. Like, if you actually genuinely want to convince somebody, and if you don't, I don't know why you're arguing. Like, why are you just spewing your opinion all over the place and creating friction if you're not trying to change somebody's mind? So the point of arguing is to influence another person. Okay, to either change their mind or help them to understand your position, which means that you have to calm down and be rational enough to think of their side. What is going to be acceptable to them? What arguments can I make? What premises can I make in order to convince them of my conclusion? Okay? So you have to think, if I'm speaking to a Democrat or I'm speaking to a Republican, if I'm speaking to a black person, white person, Mexican, Asian person, whatever, somebody from America or somebody from another country, what arguments will work for them? What are they going to accept? Okay. If you're talking to a rich person or a poor person, you know, we all have different attitudes and different things that we value. If you're talking to somebody who is pro-choice and you want to convince them that abortion is bad, you need to understand why they think abortion is okay. What is motivating them to that belief? Which means that you have to have a polite conversation with people. And you have to try to understand them, which in our society, especially today, we don't seem to put a lot of value into that. Instead, we just think we should like beat people down. You hear arguments all the time. Like, if you watch, I like to watch debates online, and people will argue their side, and the other person saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I believe. That's not, you know, that's not what I'm, like, that's not what I'm saying at all. Like, why do you keep saying this? And they just keep repeating themselves and beating them with their premises that have nothing to do with what the person's actual beliefs are. You're not going to change somebody's mind. Okay, so like, for instance, nowadays we call everybody a racist for anything, you know, and to the point where saying somebody is a racist almost is meaningless at this point. So if somebody says, you know, I think that, I don't know, what's something that people will call racist. I think we should have voter ID. When you vote, you need to prove who you are. Okay, well, you're a racist if you believe that. Well, maybe the person is, maybe the person isn't. You need to ask them, why is it that you think we need voter ID laws? Well, I think we need voter ID laws because we have a lot of fraud, and people will come in and, you know, say they're somebody and they're actually not. So if we have ID, then it prevents the issues. Okay, so then you can address that, or you can say, well, have you considered an element of racism, if that's what you think is part of it? Okay, so if you can address, and that's sort of part of the rebuttal part, if you can address what their issue is, and if you can use premises that are acceptable to them, you might actually be able to have a productive argument and get your point across. Okay, and isn't that what you want, right? Isn't that the whole point? Okay, but it means that you have to be first of all, you have to be patient, you have to be low enough emotions, and you have to care enough to sit there and listen to what the other person says and actually take in what they're saying. Okay, and that's very difficult for a lot of people. Okay. Okay, so what is acceptable? You guys can see better if I write over here, yeah, than if I write there? Okay, trying to keep it in this direction. So, what is acceptable? Well-established facts. Water freezes at, what does water freeze at? 32 degrees, is that right? Fahrenheit, yeah. 0 degrees Celsius. Okay, we all know that. Well, maybe we don't all know that, but the majority of people know that, and everybody accepts that that's true. Nobody argues with that. Okay, it's a well-established fact. Okay. Now, occasionally you do find people who argue with well-established facts, and that's just when you go that there's no point in even having this. It's like if we can't even agree that, you know, the sun is round and, you know, the whatever, there's an atmosphere or something, I don't know, then what's the point of even having this debate? Okay. So, well-established facts. Reliable observations. Okay. If you've observed something or somebody you trust observed something, then maybe that's acceptable. Now, testimony, eyewitness testimony is tricky. Okay, eyewitness testimony is considered only about 20% accurate. So observation is not the strongest argument, but it's also not the weakest argument. Okay, observations are valid. Testimony, eyewitness testimony is valid, especially the more people who have seen something. So, for instance, did George Washington exist? First president. You guys are all saying yes. Did you see him? How do you know he existed? You never met him. So how do you know he existed?
Research.
What kind of research?
History books.
History books. And where do the history books get their information from?
People who have met him.
People who did meet them, okay? Reliable observations. He wrote things, which we can still find. People wrote about him. Lots of people wrote about him. The amount of people involved in a conspiracy to fake George Washington would be astounding. Okay, the chances that George Washington was a fake is so minimal, right? There's so many reliable observations that we just accept it as fact. Okay, which makes sense. Could it have been fake? Could it be this massive conspiracy theory? I guess, but that would be really dumb. Okay, so why would we do it? So reliable observation is an acceptable way to argue, even though eyewitness testimony with a single individual is maybe not quite as reliable. Okay. Previously established conclusions. So if you have a conclusion from another argument where you guys both agreed, you can say, okay, look, we agreed on this. So if this is true, then this must also be true. Okay, we agreed that George Washington did exist, so therefore, I don't know, something else about George Washington. Okay, therefore this book he wrote must be by him. Well, that may not be the strongest argument, but okay, you get the point. If we agree, the flat Earth theory. Okay, any flat earthers in here? No? Okay, thank goodness. Don't admit to it if you are. No, you can, but I will laugh at you, but you can admit to it. So if you're arguing with somebody, debating with somebody on the flat Earth theory, then you might say, okay, so there was an experiment that was done back in, I don't know, a long time ago, where the scientists put up like towers with great distance between the towers, and they measured the shadow of each tower. If the towers were on a flat plane, then at the same time of day, the shadow would be the exact same length. But if it's rounded, then the shadow at the same time of day, one shadow is going to be longer than another shadow. Okay, can we agree with that? Okay. If that science isn't making sense to you, then let me know and I'll send you a video that explains it. But most people with a lick of science, once you think about it, that makes sense. Okay, so therefore, if that is true, then must it also not be true that the Earth is round? Okay, so you can use that conclusion. If you can get somebody to agree to one conclusion, oftentimes you can use that conclusion to get them to agree to another conclusion and kind of push them down a road. That's a very common debate tactic. Okay, testimony from authorities. So authority figures we give more credence to. They're more believable. Okay, we expect them to be experts. Okay, so if I say, my doctor told me that this is the right medication for this illness or something. So maybe you should ask your doctor about the same medication. You're probably much more likely to go and talk to your doctor than if I said my grandma says this is what you should take. Okay, so you've got an authority figure versus somebody who's not an authority figure. However, not all people agree on the authority of an authority figure. So one example from your book is like the CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, say that taking COVID vaccinations are, good for you or whatever. But there's a lot of people who think the CDC and WHO are terrible organizations that do a really bad job. So that's another part of it needing to be acceptable to the audience is the authority figure an authority figure for that person? That's something you have to consider. Because if I say, well, God says you should do X, Y, and Z, does that matter to you? If you're an atheist, then that's not an authority figure for you. If I'm speaking to somebody else who's a Christian and believes in God, then that might be a good argument for them. Okay, if I say the Bible says X, Y, Z, then it depends on if you believe the Bible or not. So again, you have to tailor your arguments for that audience for what's acceptable to them. Okay. I think that's probably pretty good. Okay, so here's an example of changing an argument for the audience. So if you have a general audience, you might say something like, we should increase funding for renewable energy because it will reduce air pollution and create jobs. Okay, but maybe you're talking to like business owners, so you would change it to, we should increase funding for renewable energy because cost-benefit analysis shows a positive return on investment within 8 years. Okay, so you're going to change it depending on who you're talking to. Make sure that it is acceptable for them. But again, that requires caring. And not everybody does. I think the majority of people just want to sort of spout their opinion, and they're not really arguing, they're just venting, I guess. So it seems like. All right, so the sufficiency criteria. Premises must provide sufficient evidence. Okay, so sufficiency is about sufficient evidence. Does the evidence back up your claim? Okay. So it should attempt to use premises that are relevant and acceptable and provide sufficient grounds for accepting the conclusion. So is there enough evidence of the right kind? That's what sufficiency is saying. Okay. So this is context dependent. Okay. It depends on who you're talking to, depends on the argument, depends on the situation. What's sufficient for deciding like what you have for lunch is different than what is sufficient for deciding if somebody gets the death penalty for a crime they've committed. Okay, so sometimes a small amount of this criteria only needs to be met, and that's good enough. Sometimes you need a lot of this criteria met in order to be able to make a decision. So it just depends on the context of the argument. Okay, so what sort of things are we looking at for sufficient evidence? First of all, the right kind of evidence. In some situations, the way you feel might be good evidence. Generally speaking, your feelings are not good evidence for an argument. Okay? But if you're talking to your spouse, that might be good enough evidence. Okay? When you say X, Y, Z, it hurts my feelings. That's good enough for a marriage, okay, or for a dating relationship. If you're hurting your partner's feelings, you need to change what you're doing, okay, in some way. Or at least try to understand why it's hurting their feelings, see what you can do to change things. But if you say this guy murdered his wife because I really don't like him, that's not sufficient evidence. Okay, that's not the right kind of evidence for that situation. Okay. Are there a sufficient number of premises? If you're deciding what you want for lunch and you say, I heard that taco place next to the college is really good. Good enough reason for me. I don't need more than that. Sure, I'll go try it out. But again, if you're trying to convict someone for murder, then you probably need more than one piece of evidence for it. You're going to need a lot more premises than that. If you're trying to convince somebody that we should take away everybody's guns, you're probably going to need a lot of premises in order to convince somebody. Okay. Is the weight of the evidence appropriate? So does the evidence have the appropriate weight? Sometimes it's a good argument. Sometimes it's the right kind of evidence. Sometimes even you have the sufficient number of premises, but they're just weak. Sure, they're true, but they're just not great. It's just not great evidence. Okay, it's a little weak. I heard that this is the case. It's far different from, there was a study that was released saying XYZ. Okay, so like one example, let's see. No, I had an example of insufficient evidence. No, well, this one isn't great, but all philosophy majors are smart. My friend Jake is a philosophy major, therefore Jake is smart. Okay, it's insufficient evidence. It's not great. Okay, is there some evidence that philosophy majors are smart? Sure. It's hard reading Nietzsche, if you've ever tried, but it's not strong evidence. Okay. I think abortion is okay because fetuses are just a clump of cell and that's not life. Is that a valid premise? You can make an argument for it. Is it a strong premise? No. Because if we found an amoeba on Mars and killed it, then that astronaut would probably be going to prison. Okay. Right? So that one cell is considered valuable, but, and is considered life. But everything else, but the fetus isn't. It's just not great evidence. Okay, that might work with somebody who already believes what you believe, but it's not going to work to change somebody's mind. Okay, it's weak evidence. Okay. And then, well, I already talked about this. Context-appropriate standards, right? So depending on the context, certain standards are appropriate and certain aren't. Okay, deciding what you have for lunch versus deciding if somebody should get the death penalty for murder. What is appropriate, what is sufficient, is going to change. Okay. So you might have to add additional premises. You might have to find evidence that is stronger, that's more supported by research. If you're talking to your friends, then saying, I heard the other day on TV XYZ is true. That's a different conversation than like if you are, in a professional debate with a professional debater and you have to provide the actual research evidence, like you might have to look up the actual research in order to prove it. So things are different depending on the context. Okay, you might have to. Well, yeah, I guess that's enough. I don't want to keep beating this dead horse. So I think that probably gets the idea, right? So now on to the last criteria, which is the rebuttal principle. Okay, criterion 5. So this is the most rare one. This is the one people typically forget about. Okay. The rebuttal principle is that you must effectively address anticipated criticisms. Okay? So rebuttal, you must address anticipated criticisms. And I should add serious criticisms. Okay. And like I said, this is often missing from arguments entirely. People rarely think about doing this within their argument. Okay. But it's really important for a strong argument. If you include this, then it seriously strengthens your argument. Okay, you're going to be much better off if you do this. Okay, so why it matters is that real-world issues are complex. Okay, and if your argument doesn't address obvious counter-arguments, then you might appear naive, you might appear intellectually dishonest. Okay, and all of those are going to weaken your position. It's going to weaken your argument, and then, like I said before, it's going to put people in a psychological headspace of disagreeing with you and make them less likely to change their opinion. So, for instance, there was a research project that was done where students attended a workshop about abortion. I can't remember if it was pro-choice or pro-life. But in one group, they had the students just come in and listen to the workshop and then answer a questionnaire about, did this change your opinion on anything? In another workshop, they started it by having the students write out what their opinion was before the workshop. In the version where the students wrote out their opinion first, they were much less likely to change their opinion. Okay, because they anchored themselves in their opinion, and then they viewed everything through that lens. Okay, so you want to have an argument in a way where people stay open to hearing your opinion. Okay. It is a manipulation tactic in one sense, but you could also look at it as you should maintain an open mind when you're debating. Okay, so you don't want to do anything in a debate or an argument in order to get people to close off their mind already before you've even started. Okay. So some requirements of this, that you anticipate the objections, right? You anticipate the criticisms, and then you address the criticisms directly when you're presenting your argument. So you address the criticisms, and then you provide the counter arguments. So it's almost like you're having the argument all on your own and cutting the person out of it. Okay. And within doing this, you should be demonstrating awareness of alternate views. Okay. And this one in particular is really powerful because if people feel heard and understood, they're much more likely to take what you have to say seriously. They're much more likely to listen because they feel listened to. And this works in debates about politics, it works in your relationships. Okay, so when you're having an argument with your boyfriend, your girlfriend, or your husband or wife or whatever, then if you say, look, I know that this is how you feel about something, but I think we should do it anyways because of X, Y, Z. Okay, then they know that you understand their position, they understand where you're coming from. You know, and I know you feel this way, but I think you shouldn't feel this way because of whatever. Okay. I know you don't want to go visit my mother because she treated you badly last time. And I understand why you wouldn't. I wouldn't want to feel that way. But I still want to visit her because of these reasons. And when we go, then I'm going to make sure, I'm going to talk to her before we go and let her know that her behavior is unacceptable. Okay. And then it's hard to argue with that. Because you've said, I understand where you're coming from, and here's my solution for your issue. So therefore, and this is the reason why I think we should go. So they're much more likely to be willing to go. Okay, is that making sense? Yeah. But again, all of these require patience, understanding, compassion, caring about the other person's opinion in the first place, which is surprisingly rare in everyday arguments as well as relational arguments. That doesn't always happen. Okay? Or you might start out an argument like, I know you don't want to go visit my mom, but I don't understand why. Will you tell me why? So that you can learn what their criticisms are so that you can then address them. Okay? But you have to stay calm and non-reactive and get that out of them first, okay? Which can be surprisingly hard in a relationship, because a lot of people are afraid to be honest with each other and tell the truth. Okay? I was teaching a Psych 101 class this morning, and we were talking about unconscious biases in gender, and so they were calling out like how they feel about men or how they feel about women. And with the men, one of the ones that they were saying is that men are liars. And I'm like, and women aren't? Like, really? Like, everybody's a liar. We all lie. Like, it's not a gendered thing, right? Because we're all afraid. And so, therefore, we all lie, which is one of the reasons why you have to work on being less afraid. Okay? But it's hard, especially in some of our family of origins. If you're honest, you got punished hard for it. So then you go into a relationship, and being honest in that relationship is very difficult. Yeah. All right, which is also why we struggle with doing these, meeting these criterion, because we usually did not learn how to have appropriate arguments in our relationships growing up. All right, the level of rebuttal is going to change depending on the audience as well. Okay, so how many counter arguments do you include, right? How much rebuttal? So it sort of depends on the complexity of your audience, okay? So if you have like a simple audience, then you just do like the general major criticisms. Okay. There's some criticisms that everybody's going to bring up. Everybody knows like the general ideas of like whether you're for or against gun control. But you may not know the deeper nuances that somebody who is really into gun control would, or anti-gun control would understand. If it's a sophisticated audience, so if you're giving a speech to the NRA, the National Rifle Association, you're going to have to include multiple criticisms. You can't just address the major general ones. You need to address multiple ones, and you need to address the deeper ones, and it's going to require a lot of research. Okay? And then in academic contexts, so if you're doing like a university debate or something, like, I don't know, Ben Shapiro goes to universities and does debates, okay? Then it has to be pretty comprehensive. You're going to have to be able to address everything. Okay? It's going to be very different than a debate with a friend or a debate with somebody on, Reddit. Okay? So it just sort of depends on who you're arguing with. Something like this with just like your friend over lunch is going to drive them crazy. Some people do that though. My uncle does this. I hate going to meals with him because I know it's going to be like three hours of him arguing about stuff that I'm not even interested in. Like, why are we talking about this? Okay. Whereas if he kept it more like simple or maybe even sophisticated, like, okay, that might be interesting. I might actually enjoy a meal with you, but like, please just stop. Okay. So you really have to tailor arguments to your audience so that they're willing to listen. Okay. And I don't know why you'd waste your breath if you're talking to somebody who's not willing to listen, or you're not trying to make them listen. All right, let's see if there's anything else I want to talk about. Okay, just a few more things. All right, decision making. So they presented their argument. Now what decision are you going to make about their argument? Okay. If no argument meets all 5 criteria adequately, then you might use what's called the suspension of judgment principle. I'm going to suspend my judgment. I'm not going to make judgment. I'm not going to make a decision. You don't have to make a decision about an argument. You don't have to be persuaded one way or the other. Okay? You really should not avoid, or you really should avoid making hasty conclusions. Okay? If you don't know what decision to make, don't make a decision. And again, you'd be surprised how many times people do that, like joining a cult, for instance. It sounds good, they're being pressured into it, things are getting emotional, they're getting hooked into it. People who meet and greet for cults are very charismatic. Again, not good arguments, but they're being pushed into it. Instead of saying, you know what, I just need to take a little bit of time and make this decision. It happens all the time. Okay? If you don't know what to do, then just don't do anything. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to make a decision. It is perfectly okay to say, I have come to no conclusion regarding this argument. I'm going to have to think about it more and stick to that. Okay? It's intellectual humility. That's a good thing. There's a lot of intellectuals who do not have intellectual humility. A lot of college professors who don't have intellectual humility. Way more common than it should be. That's totally fine. Okay. It's okay to say, I don't know. And I think the school system is not good at teaching that. And we always have to have an answer. And so it kind of pushes this idea that you should always know, you should always be able to come up with the answer. And maybe that's true in academics, but it's not true in the rest of life. Okay. And then we have the resolution principle. You're coming to a resolution. You're getting an answer. This is when all 5 of the criteria have been met sufficiently. You should be able to make a decision then. Okay. If an argument sufficiently meets all 5 of these criteria, you could even say that you're obligated to accept the conclusion. Not that you can say that, you should say that. That is the truth. You are obligated to accept the conclusion. Notice the way you feel about it is not one of the criteria. If it is structured, a well-structured argument, if all of the premises are relevant, if all of the premises are acceptable, if they're all sufficient, and all of the counter-arguments have been addressed, how could you not accept the conclusion? Now, that doesn't happen all that often, okay, but it does happen, and people will still be like, well, I don't care. It's just, I don't care. Remember, I was in a debate with a religious friend, a Catholic friend. Anybody Catholic in here? Yeah, okay. I'm not picking on Catholicism, I'm just using this as an example. We were just having a debate about the belief in the Catholic Church that certain people shouldn't marry, right? Priests and nuns shouldn't get married. And I was saying, and in a premise that was acceptable to him because he was Catholic, right? So premise number 1 is the Bible is true, which is an acceptable premise for him. And in the Bible, it says that forbidding marriage is a teaching of demons. And I said, so therefore, isn't the conclusion that it's wrong to forbid marriage? Okay, so that was a moralistic debate that he found acceptable. But instead of, and we had a lot more rebuttal and counter arguments and so on. So I personally think it was a well-formed argument. But his response is, well, that can't be right because Catholicism says it's not right, so we'll just have to go talk to a priest about it. I just remember being so frustrated, and I'm like, but it's a good argument. Like, how could you not accept the conclusion to this argument? But he just didn't like the conclusion. Okay, he didn't have a counter argument that I missed. He didn't have issue with any of the premises. He just absolutely refused to accept the conclusion of a good argument. Okay. If he had to come up with a counter argument or something or saying, well, this premise is wrong, that would have been a valid debate, right? But it was just, I just refused, even though it's a good argument, I just absolutely refused to accept the conclusion. Okay, and people do that all the time, which is very frustrating when you have a good argument for somebody. You're like, but it makes sense. I don't care. I still don't care. And people say that all the time. I still don't care. I'm still not going to believe it, or I'm still not going to accept it. So it can be very frustrating when you are debating with people who are not intellectually honest, who don't have that intellectual humility. Okay, if a conclusion is good, you should accept it. Okay? But only if it's met those 5 criteria. If it's met those 5 criteria and you're refusing to accept the conclusion, you need to ask yourself why. Why am I unwilling to accept the conclusion when it's a good argument? Okay? Maybe you suspect that there's still something wrong with the argument, and that's valid. Okay? You're saying, I don't know, I don't see where the issue is, but I feel like there is an issue somewhere, and I need to think about it more to see if maybe there are more counter arguments that you didn't address. Maybe one of the premises is inaccurate, so I'm going to think about it more. But we're saying, let's say, God comes down from on high and says, this person's argument has met all 5 criteria perfectly. There's nothing that's inaccurate. And then you still say, yeah, well, I'm still not going to believe it. Right? That would be intellectually dishonest. And so you have to be honest with yourself and say, why am I unwilling to accept a good argument for something? And a lot of people are. A lot of people just at the end of the day are just like, yeah, I'm still not going to change my mind. You'll never convince me.